Hello everyone. Welcome to the Self-Knowledge course. Today we're going to explore a very important topic, the processes of evolution and involution that we, as sparks of life, experience in this physical existence. We'll look at how we have evolved and involuted through the different kingdoms of nature and understand the purpose behind it. We will also learn about the law of revolution, a key principle that allows us to break free from the mechanical cycle we are caught in, while recovering the wisdom we have gathered along the way. The purpose of today's discussion is to help us clearly understand why we are here on this planet and how we can fulfill that purpose. And why is this topic so important? Because if we never reach that moment of clarity where we truly understand why we exist, we will remain trapped in the cycle of the Wheel of Samsara. We will keep repeating the same actions, making the same mistakes, and missing the opportunity to awaken. First, let's understand what the laws of evolution and involution are. These two laws are entirely mechanical and always depend on each other. They are at work in everything around us. We can observe that everything follows a cycle. It begins, grows, declines, and eventually comes to an end. Take living beings, for example, plants, animals, and people. They are born, evolve, reach their peak, then begin to weaken and deteriorate until, eventually, they die. But this cycle isn't limited to living things. A company starts, expands, reaches a peak of success, and eventually declines until it collapses. Even entire civilizations follow this pattern. Throughout history, great and powerful civilizations have risen, reached their peak, and then fallen in the same way. This shows us that nothing escapes these two laws. The important thing to understand is that our essence also goes through this process, as it is subject to the mechanics of the universe. With this in mind, let's explore how we evolve through the four kingdoms of nature. Most people believe they are only their physical body, but in reality, we are much more than that. This body is merely a vehicle, an instrument that our essence, our spirit, or our consciousness is using to navigate this dimension. This essence, this consciousness that we truly are, is a divine spark. It originally came from the source, whether we call it God, the Absolute, or the sacred Absolute Sun. Every spark originates from the sacred Absolute Sun with a purpose: to attain mastery or self-realization. This tells us that our existence has meaning. We are here to gain wisdom through the experiences we live. However, in the process, we also create the ego as we pass through the different kingdoms of nature. In other words, our time in this physical world is like a course, a master's degree in which we gather wisdom, so that, once we achieve self-realization, we can return to the source in full awareness. When these sparks leave the sacred Absolute Sun, they do so through one of the 7 rays of creation and become connected to the Wheel of Samsara. This wheel ascends in evolution, led by Anubis, and descent into involution, led by Typhon. At the start of this journey, each spark has only 3% free and conscious essence, while the remaining 97% is innocent and easily trapped. As the spark moves through the different kingdoms of nature, this 97% essence becomes imprisoned within the ego it gradually creates. Within this wheel, each spark is given 300,000 esoteric years to achieve self-realization. These 300,000 esoteric years are symbolized by the formation of 3,000 souls. This means that each spark has the opportunity to turn this wheel 3,000 times, and in each complete cycle, it creates a soul by passing through the different kingdoms of nature. Upon reaching the human kingdom in each cycle, the spark is granted 108 human existences, 108 physical bodies, providing a chance to develop the soul and achieve self-realization. If we fail to accomplish this, the soul we created during that cycle will be lost as we descend into involution. The spark will then have to enter another turn on the wheel and start the process anew, creating a new soul from the beginning. Now, if we do the math, 1 soul per cycle multiplied by 3,000 cycles times 108 human lives per soul. This totals 324,000 human physical bodies, meaning we are given 324,000 opportunities as humans to awaken our consciousness and achieve self-realization. It is important to understand that not all sparks reach self-realization. Many continue cycling through evolution and involution until their opportunities are exhausted, never reaching the moment of revolution that would allow them to awaken their consciousness and achieve self-realization. Every spark has free will and is not obligated to attain victory. However, there are three possible outcomes on the wheel. The first alternative is triumph. This is achieving the intimate self-realization of the being within any of these given opportunities. The second alternative is failure. This is exhausting all opportunities without awakening consciousness, ultimately returning to the absolute with only the original 3% of free consciousness, just as it descended. And the third alternative is renouncing the wheel. In some cases, the divine mother of a spark may determine that it doesn't have the strength to endure the pressures of the wheel. In this situation, the ego is cleansed in a process of involution, and the spark is returned to the absolute with only the same 3% of free consciousness, just like a failed spark. Now, let's take a closer look at the process of evolution. Once the spark emanates from the sacred absolute sun, it enters the wheel through the mineral kingdom. In this stage, our spark becomes connected to the physical body of an evolutionary mineral, such as a precious stone, a metal, or even a grain of sand. At this point, our soul is known as a gnome or pygmy. This means that when we first enter the Wheel of Samsara, our spark moves freely in the fourth dimension, but its silver cord is linked to an evolutionary mineral, where it begins its learning process. Even though minerals appear inert to us and seem lifeless, in reality, they serve as the physical bodies for sparks that are undergoing their first lessons in this kingdom. At this stage, the spark is assigned its first brain, which is the emotional brain. This allows it to experience simple emotions, though it has no psychological defects yet. However, it will begin to develop them over time. The only responsibility of the spark in the mineral kingdom is to attend the natural school, where it is taught the lessons specific to this stage of evolution. The spark remains in this kingdom for thousands or even millions of years, gradually forming its first psychological defects. The earliest defects to develop are those of disobedience toward the guru's devas of nature. Over time, other defects begin to emerge, such as antipathy and similar tendencies. Once Anubis observes that the spark has accumulated enough defects, he transfers it to the plant kingdom, where its evolution continues. In the plant kingdom, our spark became connected to an evolutionary plant, according to the original ray to which we belong. This could have been a majestic tree, a fruit-bearing plant, a flowering plant, or a medicinal herb, etc. At this stage, our soul was known as an elemental. The spark continues with the same 3% of free consciousness it had from the beginning, but now it evolves while carrying the defects it developed in the mineral kingdom. Here, the spark is assigned a second brain, the motor, instinctive sexual brain. This brain allows for more advanced experiences. In addition to the basic emotions of liking and disliking, which the emotional brain introduced in the mineral kingdom, the spark now develops instinct, which begins to record these emotional experiences. As a result, new psychological defects emerge, related to fear, sadness, pleasure, and pain. The spark also gains slight mobility, allowing it to move toward sunlight to absorb more energy, adjust its roots in search of more nutrients, and compete for resources, struggling against parasitic plants and environmental challenges. This struggle for survival introduces new psychological defects, as the spark now feels pain and must learn from nature in order to grow stronger. Additionally, thanks to this second brain, the spark develops the ability to reproduce, marking another step in its evolution. In this kingdom, the spark must learn everything about plants and their uses. Interestingly, once we begin to awaken our consciousness, we start to remember this ancient knowledge, allowing us to understand the healing and nutritional properties of plants as we once did during this stage of evolution. Once our guru saw that we had accumulated enough defects, we were disconnected from the plant kingdom and connected to the animal kingdom, where our evolution continued. In the animal kingdom, our soul was called anima, and it was connected to the physical body of an evolutionary animal, a pure-blooded animal, a beautiful wild animal, or an animal that gives food. The spark maintains its 3% of consciousness and retains the two brains of the plant kingdom, but now with more developed capacities. No longer rooted in one place, it can now move to seek its own food and learn to defend itself from other animals. At this stage, it begins to develop all its animal instincts: fornication, violence, fear, and survival-driven behaviors. As it learns to navigate a wild environment, it creates new defects, shaped by the struggles of animal existence. After many years, passing through various species in this kingdom and accumulating numerous defects, the Guru Deva of the animal kingdom transfers the spark to the human kingdom, where its evolution continues. In the human kingdom, our spark is now called a soul. Here the spark receives a third brain that is the intellectual brain. So now, in addition to the emotional brain and the motor, instinctive, sexual brain, we have a third brain that gives us the ability to reflect and judge our actions. Therefore, as human beings, we can gradually eliminate all the defects that we have been creating and rescue the wisdom that is trapped in them. Also, since we now have an upright spine, we can consciously direct our sexual energy through our spine to create our internal bodies. And also, we can develop love, consciously sacrificing ourselves for others. Therefore, it is in this kingdom where we have the opportunity to awaken our consciousness and achieve self-realization. In this kingdom, we will have the right to 108 existences as humans. That is, we have the right to be born and die 108 times in human physical bodies. The first time our silver cord was connected to a human physical body, it was in a baby born in a tribe, in a place far from civilization, where people were still connected with the nature from which they had just arrived. Thus, the first existences always take place far from civilization. Of those 108 existences, the first 54 occur in an evolutionary condition. But even so, the human being creates many psychological defects during his evolutionary existences as a human. When the 54th existence is completed, the evolution will be over. And the human, due to all the ego that has been created, will begin the involution. Although he is still entitled to another 54 existences, he is now a humanoid. But now, as a humanoid, the instinct puts the intellect at its service, and the soul or psyche quickly blackens. He is completely filled with the ego in those 54 remaining existences. In any case, he still has the opportunity to wake up and seek self-realization at any time during those 54 remaining existences. It is good that we investigate in a conscious astral unfolding, in which of the 108 existences we are currently in this cycle, and we can also investigate how many times we have turned the wheel. As we see here, up to this point, the ego is always evolving. We will be creating more and more ego, and our consciousness will be more and more trapped and asleep. If we do not take advantage of our soul, we will lose it. Since once our 108 existences as humans are exhausted, without taking advantage of any of those 108 opportunities to release all our energy and our consciousness and create the existential bodies of the being in order to achieve self-realization, we will enter the submerged involution, until nature disintegrates the last of the psychological aggregates and we achieve the second death. Now let's take a closer look at what exactly involution is. Once the 108 human existences in a cycle have been exhausted without working on ourselves, our spark will no longer remain in the human kingdom. Instead, it will be connected to an involutionary animal. The silver cord will be linked, for example, to a stray dog, a donkey forced to work tirelessly, or even a pest such as a rat or a cockroach. While our spark remains contaminated with ego, it must undergo a deep purification process. To free itself from these accumulated defects, it will descend through the 9 Dantian circles, where it will remain until nature completely disintegrates all the psychological aggregates. During this descent, the spark will experience various animal bodies. Then it will move into different involutionary plant forms. Continuing downward through the kingdoms, it will eventually reach the involutionary mineral kingdom, where it will become connected to decomposing minerals. These steps must be taken because the sun cannot have idle sparks. Every spark must serve the law of the trogus. Eat and be eaten, swallow and be swallowed. All must fulfill their role as sustenance for nature and other beings. This is the inevitable fate of those who have not freed themselves from the body of attachments, whose essence remains trapped within the ego. Throughout involution, nature will gradually break down all the psychological defects, leading to what is known as the second death. This entire process can take thousands or even millions of years. In the end, the spark will emerge completely cleansed of ego, retaining only the original 3% of consciousness. However, it will have lost the created soul and all the wisdom gained throughout that cycle of the wheel. At this point, the spark will be reconnected to the evolutionary mineral kingdom, beginning a new turn on the wheel to create a new soul once again. If we reflect on this reality, we will deduce that it is absurd to believe that we can aspire to constant evolution. It is naive to think that merely allowing time to pass will lead us to a quantum leap in consciousness, the awakening of the pineal gland, or a greater state of awareness, without actively working on our own psychology. It is equally absurd to expect that different results will come, while humanity continues to act in the same way, committing ever greater mistakes. We might deceive ourselves into believing that advancements in technology and access to more information signify evolution. Yet, internally and spiritually, we are becoming increasingly degenerate, perverse, and cruel. Just look at our planet and see how we are systematically destroying its resources. Observe the undeniable decline in critical thinking, in art, in philosophy, in psychology, etc. If we dare to analyze ourselves sincerely, if we awaken enough to perceive our own internal decay, we will recognize that we are not in evolution but in involution. And from this realization, we will understand that what we truly need, urgently, is an internal revolution. Because only through the conscious revolution is human regeneration possible, and only through it can we free ourselves from this endless wheel of deaths and rebirths, of evolution and involution. And what is revolution? The consciousness revolution is an internal work that each one of us must undertake to bring about true transformation. This change is achieved through the three factors of the consciousness revolution. The first factor is psychological death, which consists of discovering our psychological defects through self-observation, judging them until we fully understand them, and eliminating them with the help of our particular Divine Mother. Through psychological death, the trapped consciousness is liberated from its defects. The second factor is spiritual birth, which involves the wise use of sexual creative energy to create the existential bodies of the being. This is achieved through the sexual union of man and woman, without spilling the sexual creative energy. With spiritual birth, the liberated consciousness is fixed to the spinal cord. The third factor is the sacrifice for humanity, which consists of transmitting knowledge to humanity in a selfless way so that each person who receives it can carry out their own work. Through sacrifice for humanity, love awakens. By applying these three factors, we free ourselves from the Wheel of Samsara and from the cycles of evolution and involution that have held us bound for so long. Thus, we achieve the self-realization of our being. This concludes today's conference. I hope you have been able to understand it. Remember that you can leave your questions. Thank you very much to all of you for attending this conference. We invite you to join us in the next topic, where we will talk about the infradimensions. We will explore in detail how these infradimensions are subdivided and the inner work we must do within them. From these infradimensions will emerge the light that illuminates our inner darkness, or the wisdom and love that remain trapped within our psychological defects. See you next time.